welcome to the Win Win Evangelism Podcast. My name's Dr. Tina Waldrom. In a nation where fewer people are exposed to the message of Jesus, it's more important than ever for churches and believers to be equipped to share their faith in genuine and culturally relevant ways. I'm the Director of Evangelism in Australia, and for the past 30 plus years, I've been training and equipping churches and believers to share their faith in relevant ways. Each week, this podcast will help you do exactly that. Enjoy the weekly interviews and teachings, and be sure to check out the questions in the show notes. These questions are designed so that you can use them in your church small group or simply by yourself. We're here to win, win, win. Welcome back to the show this week. I want to talk on the topic of legacy evangelism. It's something that the Lord has really burnt into my heart or dropped into my spirit, however you want to say it, about what's happening now, or something that can motivate people towards sharing their faith. Something that can motivate churches to share their faith. It's a real word in season is what I would call this. The word legacy evangelism. And it's a motivation or a new motivation that I'm feeling that the Lord wants to share with you today. So first of all, let's start with the question, when you hear the word legacy, what comes to mind? Do you think of money? Do you think of property? Do you think a name on a building or something deeper? You know, when we think of legacy, sometimes we think of that like leaving a legacy, leaving money, property, or your name is on a building, as I'm saying, or something deeper. But let me redefine what legacy means for us today. Legacy is what you leave behind in people, not just what you leave for people. Legacy is what you leave behind in people, not just what you leave for people. And as Christians, we're called to leave a spiritual legacy, something that outlives us, multiplies and carries the good news of Jesus to the next person, the next generation, and even the nations. So I'm thinking of this word legacy evangelism in two ways. I'm thinking of how I model evangelism and also how I reach people that don't know Jesus. Let's talk about legacy through example or modeling outreach. People don't just learn by being told. They learn by watching. And if we're people who want to live that outward focused evangelistic life, others will follow. But our example becomes our legacy. Our example becomes our legacy. So first up, I'm wanting us to think about how we can be an example to those around us of living this life on mission. How do you leave that legacy through your life? Can you use that as a motivation to be modeling evangelism to others? Can you, as a church leader, lead like that? Can you model that and leave that legacy through your life as the church pastor, as the church leader, as the small group leader? This legacy through example. Maybe your church, in fact, is an example to many other churches in our nation and beyond, through modeling what a church that outworks this value called evangelism, church that models that. You know, D.L. Moody once said this, out of 100 people, one will read the Bible, the other 99 will read the Christian. Out of 100 people, one will read the Bible, the other 99 will read the Christian. When I first heard that, I thought that it was kind of leaning in on how we need people to watch our lives, be influenced by seeing our lives rather than just reading the Bible, but seeing our lives. Those are the non-Christians. But I'm also seeing the power of this, of how we influence other people to be that outward focused Christian, how we influence other churches. Maybe you can think of one person right now that their legacy, in fact, they've left a deposit in you to be that person that's outward focused. Maybe there's a church that comes to mind right now that is leaving that legacy. A great question to ask would be, what would someone reading your life learn about mission, learn about evangelism? Or what would someone watching or reading your church learn about mission, learn about evangelism? Let's talk about legacy through seeds sown, even if we don't see the harvest as an individual or as a church. You know, evangelism, as I often say to those that are in our membership, I often say it's a long game. And I teach around that topic a lot. You know, Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians verse 3:6 that I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. You know, our legacy isn't just in the visible conversations, but it's in the hidden seeds that bear the fruit later. We need to take heart with that. Here's a great story. You may have heard it. I worked for the Billy Graham Association at one point in my wonderful journey. And so this is where I heard this story a lot. But Edward Kimball was a Sunday school teacher who shared Jesus with a young shoe salesman named Dwight L. Moody. And Moody later led millions to Christ. And through him, Billy Sunday came to faith. And then Mordecai Ham came to faith, who eventually preached the message that brought Billy Graham to Christ. One simple act of witness became a chain reaction that impacted the world. Kimball's legacy outlived himself as he was sowing those seeds. You know, I want to encourage you that no act of witness is ever wasted. Even if you never see the results, heaven might be full of fruit from your seeds. Even if you don't perceive that your church is seeing the results, you're sowing something into your community with those seeds. It's a legacy through seed sowing. Now, let me get back to keep talking about this legacy as a motivation, because I really feel like God has dropped that into my heart. I want to encourage you. Lean into that to be your motivation, to get up, to keep reaching out to people, that you want to sow a legacy, you want to leave a legacy. Let it be the heartbeat of your church. You know, our legacy, we want to leave a legacy as a church to our community by reaching out. Let me ask you a question. Are you equipped to share your faith? Is your church ready to do the same? Our evangelism training helps both individual believers and church leaders foster a culture of evangelism. It equips everyday Christians to have natural faith conversations and provides pastors with the tools to train their church. With flexible online resources, you can learn at your own pace, anytime, anywhere. Don't leave evangelism to chance. Visit evangelisminaustralia.com to get started. Let's talk about generational legacy. Faith can be passed down through family lines. Paul writes to Timothy, I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. I love that, from generation to generation. Timothy's evangelism legacy started with his grandmother sowing faith into her daughter, who sowed into her son. You know, I love legacy evangelism because it often starts at home. It often starts, if we take it to a corporate level, at home with our home church, with children, with grandchildren, with nieces, with nephews. You know, the seeds you plant in your family may grow into ministries and movements you'll never see. I love this idea of generational legacy. Let's lean into that as a motivation to keep outward focused and sharing the gospel. Legacy in people's stories. Ordinary faithfulness is what I call this. You know, not everyone's famous, but everyone can leave a legacy. You know, I think of the Samaritan woman in John 4. She had one encounter with Jesus and went back to her village to say, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Her testimony brought many, many people to believe. That was her legacy, this ordinary faithfulness. It's that kind of story like the Christian neighbour who always baked a cake for the family next door. And years later, when the family faced a crisis, they remembered her faith and came and asked questions or came to church. Legacy is often in ordinary kindness. Your everyday acts of kindness, your church's everyday acts of kindness, the prayers you pray, the prayers your church pray, and consistently could be someone else's turning point, could be a community's turning point. So legacy, it's a powerful concept. If we take it on, can truly motivate us, can motivate our churches to share the gospel in this hour. The life of Jesus, of course, is the greatest legacy, isn't it? The life of Jesus. Jesus didn't leave behind money. He didn't leave behind property or even writings, but his legacy were in a couple of things. Firstly, the people he discipled. He invested in 12 people who carried his message to the world. What an incredible legacy to sow that message into people around us that will carry that message to the world, to our neighbourhoods, to our streets in Jesus' name. Who can I be discipling in this way that I'm encouraging them to be that person that is outward focused? Who can I have in my world that's close enough that are watching me that can see, hey, I can do this as well. I can be that outward focused Christian. Legacy. The message he preached was his greatest legacy, the good news of the kingdom. It wasn't in the money he left behind, the property or his writing, but the message he preached, the good news of the kingdom, became his greatest legacy. I think we always need to be challenged every week in our lives to ask personally, am I a person that preaches, words or no words, words and actions, the good news of the kingdom? And is my church, the church that I lead, is my small group, the small group that I'm about, is it outward focused? Is it about bringing the good news of the kingdom? Is that the legacy that we are leaving? And I think the greatest legacy also that Jesus left was the example that he lived, the compassion, the truth, the sacrifice. The compassion, the truth, and the sacrifice became his legacy. How many hundreds of organizations there are around the world right now that are there because they were birthed through Christianity. If Christianity wasn't here today, they wouldn't be there. Let's think about the Salvation Army, for example, but there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. The example that Jesus lived, compassion, truth, sacrifice. Let's be that person. Let's be that church that leaves a legacy like that. The very reason we're here today is because Jesus sowed into people who sowed into others. Sowed into people who sowed into others. That is evangelism legacy at its absolute best. Sowing into people who sow into others with that outward focus. So lots of people lose motivation to keep sharing their faith. Churches lose motivation. I know that that's a strange thing to say. It's not that they don't want to be that outward church. Every church has a high value on outreach, on evangelism, but it's the outworking of that value that becomes challenged sometimes. And what I'm suggesting in this moment in time for the church in Australia is that let's lean into this legacy. Let's start to use this word. How can we leave a legacy in people's lives and lean into outreach that way, that's what we're trying to achieve, and appeal to ourselves that we would be that person of legacy, that we would be that church that leaves a legacy of Jesus in our community. So a couple of questions that I ask myself: what legacy of evangelism will I leave? Will people remember me as someone who kept the good news to myself, or as someone who sowed into other people's lives generously? Will your church be a church that's remembered for keeping the good news to themselves? Or will you be a church that sowed into the life of your community generously? And how can you do that more? This coming week, could you identify one person? Could you ask your church members to identify one person, a family, a neighbour, a colleague, or even a stranger that you can sow into with words of kindness, a prayer, or a simple mention of Jesus? Legacy is not built in one moment, not one big moment. Of course not, but in many small, faithful moments over time. So here's just something to leave you with. You may never know the full impact of your legacy this side of heaven, but one day you might meet people in eternity who will say, I'm here because of the seeds you sowed, or I'm here because of the church that you were a part of. I'm here that your church did this, Pastor such and such. Thank you for turning your church outward. I'm here because of you today. My son's here. My daughter's here. Just imagine if we lean into this word legacy and start to let it motivate us as an individual believer, but let it motivate us as a church leader, pastor, and speak that into our churches in Jesus' name. I'm really praying that you got something out of this episode this week, and I look forward to being with you next week.